Hello and welcome again to Eco Views and News. This evening we want to look at something that's really been put on all our menus, all our plates, all our desks for consideration, especially after the tropical storm Sandy hit New York. And that is the crisis that's emerging in the world's water supplies. This isn't something that occurred because of Sandy, but it came to the consciousness of several million people in the midst of Sandy. And the problem is pretty simple to summarize, but not simple to address, as we'll see. The problem is that we live on a very large and covered with water planet. In fact, it's the only planet in the known universe to have water in the liquid state. But we're running out of water, fresh water, to live with. So we want to look at this whole problem of what's the best way to manage the water from now on in. And we're titling it Natural Abundance versus Market Scarcity, Market Failure and the Global Water Crisis. We're living in a natural system, as I say, dominated by water. Water covers most of the Earth's surface. And it's the only known planet in the universe that we've been able to observe that has water in its gaseous, liquid, and ice forms, all three forms, and it's dominated by the water in its liquid form. So there's something wrong on this water-wealthy planet, something that we saw very quickly when millions of people were threatened with a shortage of water supplies. We live on the only blue planet in the known universe, yet as a species we may be running out of water. This is quite an extraordinary circumstance. It has to be explained and examined, and we have to get beyond the limitations that we've been applying to our use of water in order not just to make things sort of comfortable, but in order to survive. We need to address the ethical, scientific, public health, and policy dimensions of this crisis in order to avoid massive human suffering and move towards a global form of sustainability. Without this, we're in trouble. If we can't learn to live within the hydrological cycle of the Earth's ecosystem, we will become extinct. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You can't run a natural system in contradistinction to its basic principles. So we better learn fast how to readjust our set of expectations and our policies in order to avoid massive collapse. Now we saw that Tropical Storm Sandy provided us with a direct hit on a large swath of the coast of the mid-Atlantic here, right up from New Jersey through Connecticut, hitting several million people at once. And it was no mystery that those 7 million people in the greater New York area were hit with very crucial water scarcity problems very quickly, because salt water intruded into areas. Flood water coming down from the rains came down from the river systems and met in such a way as to overwhelm structures that were in place and create a disaster, which we all witnessed. Some people who were candidates at the time spoke forcefully about the moral obligation to hand things over to the private sector. A year ago, in terms of disaster relief, Romney had actually suggested that things like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, should be handed over to the private sector. This came in for a very sharp criticism right away. And in fact, as it turned out in the election, exit polls made it clear that Hurricane Sandy was a deciding factor for millions of voters in the election. That's pretty extraordinary. Millions of voters decide, in effect, because of the way the federal government acted, the policies that were being supported by one of the candidates, Romney, to privatize most of these public sector facilities like FEMA was soundly rejected by the population. And the reason was pretty simple. It didn't take long to look like you had a water problem in and around New York. There's too much of it, and it's in the wrong place. And guess what? It contains, at this point, everything that you're also running short of, your gasoline. You can see gasoline floating around here on the surface of this taxi pool here. It's a new name or a new meaning to taxi pool. It's really quite tragic. We have no fresh water in the midst of being inundated with water. Now, to respond to such a crisis like that, it doesn't seem appropriate to call for greater private sector profit-making enterprises. There's a public need, and there's need for public response to this on a massive scale, not only nationally, but now internationally. So the private sector morality of handing everything over to profit-making institutions seems a little hollow very quickly. This has been pointed out on a number of different levels. The global water security has been an issue for a while, but this year a major report came out from it's very interesting to see, in fact, who put it together. If you look at the seal very closely, you see it's the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. This is very interesting. It's a coordinator of all the intelligence agencies, the Army Intelligence, Navy Intelligence, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. All of these are coordinated by the Director of National Intelligence, and he published this Global Water Security document back in February of 2012, well before the campaign came to a close. And others have been pointing out that there are real dangers of going the private route. Vandana Shiva wrote a book whose subtitle is Privatization, Pollution, and Profit, and warning about water wars that are coming forward. She put it very directly and powerfully in this book, but also where she goes and speaks these days. You should have a look at it if you get a chance. Whenever she's around and in town, you can see what she's been saying on these issues. It's really quite striking.
We're at a transformative moment.
I believe in the next 5 years we'll have the decisive period.
You're going up against nations, multinational corporations, corporate states.
We are at the very center of what is going to happen.
About whether the commercial market logic of global corporations will work, or whether the earth logic of the sustenance of life, including our lives, will work.
We are on the cusp of a great set of decisions around what will happen to the world's water.
Okay. Well, she contrasted it in terms of the corporate logic, privatization, and maximization of profit, versus the earth logic, or ecologic, of the way water works in an ecosystem. Now, this has been brought to the attention of a number of people, but in struggles in the third world, not so much here in America, but in struggles in the third world. It's only in catastrophes like Sandy hitting major cities that we begin to see it as an American problem as well. But we ought to start paying attention to the problems that have emerged in other capital cities. Like this one, for example, that was covered in Leasing the Rain.
Who does water belong to? Who should control it? In a globalizing world, these questions drive an increasingly polarized debate. On one side are those who believe water is a public good, a human right, which cannot and should not be controlled by interests out for profit. People like Oscar Oliveira, a Bolivian labor organizer.
God has given us water. It rains in the high country, it rains on the lakes, it rains on the fields. The only thing the water company should do is to help St. Peter get the water to the people so that we all are able to use it.
Now that's a very powerful formulation. The only thing the water company should do is help St. Peter get the water to the people. A very powerful statement of a difference of opinion about who should control water. It becomes a national struggle in the country where he's operating, Bolivia.
San Pedro a trasladar el agua para que todos podamos tomar el agua.
On the other side are those who believe in the privatization of water, that the free market is the most efficient mechanism to deliver the water that people need.
If you are genuinely concerned with them getting water, what is the best route to do that? It's a practical question, it's not a moral question.
Okay, well, this is very interesting. If you're genuinely concerned, this is a practical question, not a moral question, according to John Briscoe here. John Briscoe says, well, you know, we're talking about efficiencies here. He dismisses out of hand any question of equity, right? Efficiency is what he's talking about. Efficiency is what you're interested in if you're in the private sector and want to make profits. What about equity? What about access to water? John Briscoe doesn't care. In fact, he's quite adamant about it. Take a look. It's really quite staggering.
And a declaration that water is owned by the public, to be managed by the public for the good of everybody, we've had decades of that and it hasn't worked.
I went to Bolivia because I'd heard about a conflict in which the forces of corporate globalization met fierce local resistance. It was a fight over water, and it took place in a town called Cochabamba. Bolivia is blessed with great natural beauty, but it's the poorest country in South America. 70% of its citizens live in poverty. Nearly 1 in every 10 children born here dies before the age of 5. Since the 1980s, Bolivia has been financially dependent upon the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These powerful institutions lend...
Well, they lend money to, in effect, the local population to the extent that it will privatize its water supply. This is the disaster we're up against. We can't, in effect, run a country any longer, in the case of Bolivia, because it has no access to its own water. It's been sold off to private companies. In this case, Bechtel International is behind the effort to control the water supply in the area. Now, the people got quite irritated about this and, in fact, revolted. And there were several open water wars in downtown Cochabamba about this. It went on for days and days, and in fact months and years. The same kind of logic that was being applied there is now being applied elsewhere in the global system, where corporations are gaining access to the control for access to water and to the treatment of water facilities after it's been used by municipalities. Now, the question in part will remain whether this becomes the dominant means of interacting with the natural ecosystem. If the privatization of the asset becomes the way in which the technology can be made available, then the primary concern is going to be for the return to those who've invested in it. Not necessarily for access on the part of the greatest number of people. Because what these agreements do, in effect, is guarantee a certain profit rate to the company that agrees to take on the contract, independent of whether there's water available from the annual rainfall cycle or from, as in the case of Cochabamba, the melting glaciers. Now, it's the melting glaciers that are disappearing in Cochabamba, and it's that which leads to the collapse, in fact, the total lack of water in Cochabamba, if it isn't very well managed from the rainfall cycle. It's been living for thousands of years on the melt of glaciers and on their recharge through a natural ecosystem of the snow on the glaciers melting eventually and coming down and trickling into the streams that make it possible to keep the population alive. But if that is intruded upon, then the water supply itself is in danger, no matter who manages it. The idea that private sector should manage it because they can deliver, when the water's there, more efficiently than the public sector is the argument put forward by Bechtel and the international correlate organizations they work with to engineer the flow of water. The problem is that engineering solutions in an ecosystem that has changed its parameters don't work. In effect, it's the whole rainfall, glacial deposition, glacial melt system that has gone awry in Bolivia, and therefore the management of the water through that system that guarantees only profits to those who've invested, largely foreign engineering firms, seeking a guaranteed annual rate of profit of something around 15 to 17%. It was really quite extraordinary in this case, the deal that Bechtel negotiated. These things aren't going to be tolerated by a population anymore, and that's why they stood up in the face of this crisis and began to object, as it turned out violently, and had to be repressed, the government thought, by military means, ending in many deaths and a great deal of international press. But Bolivia is not alone. The question about where the water security is going to be, how it's going to be located in a water-scarce world, is really going to be quite a problem, to the extent that the municipal water supplies are handed over to private corporations, driven, as all corporations are, by a need to make an annual profit, which they then distribute to shareholders. That's going to be one approach, but one approach which is woefully short of dealing with problems of access, especially during times of crisis. Times of crisis, like the one we just witnessed with Sandy in New York, demonstrate very clearly the inadequacy of trying to deal with a public need in terms of private profit. People who have no power in the marketplace, for example, whose savings have been totally wiped out, whose households, whose whole basis for existence can be wiped out in a 48-hour period in a storm like this, they've got no way to wade into a water purchasing deal. The municipalities that have been devastated by these kinds of natural disasters have no way to negotiate if the hands of the entire control of the water system, both access and treatment, are now firmly held by those in the private sector. What kind of negotiating position does a municipality have? Basically none. Now, we saw this dramatically with Sandy here in the United States, but I'm afraid it's becoming more and more general in all of the coastal cities throughout the entire world because of the increase of sea level around the world. This is happening on a gradual basis, and it's punctuated by dramatic events. Punctuated in the sense that these storms come along every few years, and as it now appears, maybe even more frequently. That is to say, what we thought was a 100-year storm may come along every 50 years or every 10 years. We had a sequence, for example, of Irene last year and Sandy this year. Both of them were devastating. Irene far more devastating to the areas inland, like Vermont, completely devastated by Irene. But the coastal areas were hit in heavily populated areas between Washington and New York during this Sandy storm. This is going to happen increasingly, not because we're betting on it right? It's not a gamble kind of situation. It's inevitable as the atmosphere is in effect blocking the outflow of heat from the Earth's ecosystem because of the increased CO2 and the blanketing gases. You increase the heat of the atmosphere, you're going to increase the heat of the oceans. In fact, it's the oceans that are absorbing the majority of the heat from the sun, and it's not re-radiating out. Those warm oceans give rise to these tropical storms, which some of which become hurricanes and move in a fairly rapid way to distribute that energy through the northern hemisphere. Now we're going to see that increasingly here, but think about where else the world is quite vulnerable to sea level rise and extreme weather at sea level with built infrastructure. As it turns out, it's every city that has a port. And every city that has a port often has access problems to water upstream. When you combine those two things, you're going to see an increase in what's amounting to environmental refugees. Now, we don't like to refer to American people as refugees. That often is something we like to think of as happening somewhere else. We're not subject to that. We're Americans, right? Well, there are going to be large portions of American coastal populations in the decades ahead that are in effect refugees. There are certainly portions of that already in Staten Island and parts of northern New Jersey. They can't go back to their residences. There are several places in Connecticut that have been roped off to their residences. Can't go back. They say, well, I've got to clean out my refrigerator, everything's melting. No, you can't. You're not going to go back for 6 months, is the current rule in some of these areas. You're not going to go back ever in some other cases where the property has been destroyed. And these are, in effect, climate refugees. But this isn't the largest concentration, nor the most desperate yet, to be affected by this combination of increased sea level and increased probability of storm events. Think for a moment, and we'll deal in greater detail in future sessions, for what's happening in the circum-Mediterranean, the whole area around the Mediterranean. Seaports everywhere. Some of them in areas that are very close to sea level, don't have mountain ranges behind them. Some of them do have mountain ranges and can retreat, as it were, uphill. Not easily, but they can do so, certainly in emergency evacuation circumstances. But there are some of those cities and some of those settled areas along the sea that are very close to sea level for a long stretch inland. Don't have much of a relief, as it were, accidental relief to, say, mountain ranges behind them, and are pushed up against further populations to the interior. Take, for example, the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is basically one long beach with two roads. As sea level comes along and increases in that part of the world, you're going to see a really dramatic change in the pressures on an already stressed population. It's a population that's continuously stressed because of the nature of the political circumstance it's facing. But if you start to think of them as potential environmental refugees on top of their political refugee status, you can see some of the crises that are about to unfold over the next years and decades. Just to the south of that, in Egypt, there is the Alexandria Egyptian plain that comes out. It's the Nile Delta, feeds out. Very flat area. Two things are happening simultaneously, and that is sea levels rising and intruding salt water into the lens of fresh water in these areas, polluting, making undrinkable the freshwater supplies. At the same time, that makes it difficult, in some cases impossible, to grow food, because the roots of the plants are getting killed off by the salt water. At the same time, on a third level, the habitations themselves are being flooded more frequently with extreme weather events. Now, without food, without water, and without habitation, you're going to have potentially 3 million environmental refugees, it's estimated, by the middle of the century. Keep in touch online or on air, and we'll keep covering these issues. Thank you very much.